The first-class cabin glowed like a hush of sunrise, dim, honeyed lights, leather that gleamed softly, glassware that chimed when tucked into its place. The aisle was wide enough to make you walk slower, to notice the stitched headrests with the winged insignia, the polished chrome around the seat controls, the discreet flowers near the galley that turned a machine into a lounge. Boarding music pulsed at a pleasant heartbeat, the kind you felt more than heard. She moved through it all with a quiet grace that made people unconsciously straighten as she passed. Not dramatic. Not loud. A presence that didn't ask for attention but gathered it anyway. She had spent a lifetime teaching rooms to listen before she spoke. Today was supposed to be a rare break, an evening flight home after a week of negotiations that would have drained 3 lesser executives and left them grinning anyway. The navy suit carried afternoon creases. A single fine necklace touched the hollow of her throat, warm from her skin. She held one overnight bag, the kind that whispered old money without announcing anything at all. She glanced at the boarding pass, seat 1A, and the faintest smile touched her mouth. A window, forward cabin, the left side. She liked looking out at the wing at night, navigation lights like tiny stubborn stars. The seat was occupied. The woman in it had arranged herself with the thoughtless comfort of a cat in a sunbeam. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, glossy lips, sunglasses still on despite the cabin light, a silk scarf carefully knotted so its ends fell like a signature. She was already sipping champagne. Her heels occupied the footwell. One shoe slipped off just enough to say the rules bent around her. A designer tote sprawled across the other pillow like an animal that had claimed territory. There was a mechanical click in the brain of the observer. This happens sometimes, but it's simple to fix, followed immediately by a colder click. This is going to be work. She stopped, drew a breath measured enough to be invisible, and placed a hand at the headrest to steady herself as the boarding line paused behind her. "Excuse me," she said not loudly. "I believe 1A is mine." The woman's sunglasses tipped down the length of her nose. An expression like a smile held on a hook. "I don't think so. My boarding pass." She lifted it, calm, offering the small rectangle of truth. The woman didn't look at it. She looked at her. Up and down, a quick calculation that arrived at a conclusion the way a lottery ticket tears along the perforation. "First class is, you know, limited," the woman said with a light laugh, the kind designed to make the cabin take her side by default. "Sometimes they overbook. You should check with the attendant. I'm sure there's something more suitable back there." The last 2 words were set carefully on the air, like a pair of earrings too heavy to wear for long. People nearby shifted. A businessman across the aisle pretended to fix his cufflink. A couple in 2D and 2F both found their phones intensely interesting. The attendant at the galley, young, ponytail tugged tight in nervous precision, flowed forward, smiling the way people smile when stepping between strangers whose voices have not risen yet but might. "Is there a problem?" the attendant asked. "Not at all," the woman in 1A answered before anyone else could, her amusement cool and crystalline. "She's just confused about her seat. Happens all the time." The attendant's gaze flicked to her face, then to the boarding pass still held steadily in her hand. The attendant took it with professional grace, scanned the name, scanned the seat, felt a bead of stress lift like a temperature. "This does say 1A," the attendant said, softly apologetic, as if apologizing for announcing the weather. "Oh," the woman said. Her lips parted. She produced her own boarding pass with a theatricality that set the nearby shoulders at attention. "How strange. Because mine says 1A as well. And I was here first." 2 rectangles of paper, 2 claims. The attendant's cheeks flushed in that particular mortified pink of people instructed to ensure seamless luxury and faced with a seam ripped down the middle. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "This must be a double booking. I can speak with the gate agent and—" "There's no need to inconvenience everyone," the woman interrupted, tilting her head toward the aisle as if excusing a misunderstanding at a garden party. "Just find her a seat, back there. She'll be comfortable. And we can push back on time." The words stitched themselves into the silence like barbed thread. Back there. Comfortable. The neat lines of the cabin seemed to narrow. The attendant glanced at the occupied seat, then back at her, then toward the curtain shielding the rest of the aircraft. The curtain, that soft velvet boundary between two versions of the same flight, swayed slightly with the air that hummed from the vents. "I pay for this seat," the woman in 1A added, and the way she said paid placed a tiny weight on the word that made the light around it tilt. "I fly this airline constantly. They know me." She, standing in the aisle, remembered a boardroom last spring in which 15 men discussed the possibility of recliners that faced each other for dining, arguing about fork angles and linen weight, while she looked at a blueprint and imagined exactly how a stranger would feel in 1A at midnight over the Atlantic. She remembered the night she looked at a balance sheet that said in code, "If you cut cost, you cut dignity." She remembered saying no. She remembered winning. She could name, without thinking, the serial number of the plane based on the cabin refurbishment. She had chosen the palette herself, that precise deep blue, that calm brushed steel. No, she thought. Not today. "I understand it's complicated," she said, and her voice did not wobble. "But my seat is 1A. I'm happy to stand aside while you sort it." The attendant swallowed, nodding rapidly. "Yes, of course. Let me just—" She looked to the galley where another attendant was already lifting a phone, whispering codes into it, glancing up, whispering again. Boarding slowed. The steady parade of quiet wealth, newborns and bassinets, honeymooners with shy smiles, business travelers who measure travel in gray hairs, all of them pulled behind her, their patience a limited currency. The woman in 1A slipped her sunglasses up again, as though the scene were too bright. "There's a standard," she said conversationally to no one in particular, which is to say, to everyone. "First class is about the right fit." Something under the words pressed down. The people who had been pretending not to listen began pretending very hard. The businessman across the aisle lifted his eyes, then lowered them, stumbled between the safety of silence and the risk of saying something true. The couple in 2D2F slid glances to each other, tiny conspiracies of discomfort. The young attendant's fingers trembled slightly as she took the woman's boarding pass, scanned, rescanned, pursed her lips, then forced them to relax into hospitality. "Perhaps," the attendant offered, "one of you could take 2A for now, and once we've confirmed the manifest." "Why should I move?" the woman asked, without looking up. "I'm settled. She can go." It was ridiculous. It was small. And somehow it was not small at all. It was the aperture of a camera closing down, letting in less light. It was the press of eyes that refused to meet hers. It was the knowledge, ancient and banal, that sometimes the price of peace is your own dignity wrapped in tissue paper and slipped into someone else's bag. She felt the tightness in her jaw, a familiar thread pulled taut. She glanced at the headrest where the logo was stitched clean and simple, the needlework precise. She had chosen the thread manufacturer after inspecting 6 samples between her fingers. She had argued that little things were not little at all, and she had built a company on the idea that comfort is not a privilege, but a promise. Her promise. To everyone. "May I see both of your IDs, please?" the second attendant asked, arriving with a tablet and a relieved expression, as if a solution could be conjured by enough tapping. The woman flicked her license like a card trick. "I'm sure you'll find I'm a loyal customer," she said again, and the way she said loyal sounded like a leash that only fit certain necks. She gestured vaguely toward the seated rows beyond the curtain. "You know how these mistakes happen." The attendant did not answer. The tablet watched, impersonal. Names. Numbers. Statuses. The plane was a body coiled to leap, engines not yet alive and already impatient. A small boy, somewhere behind economy's curtain, giggled at a video. A baby hiccuped. The scent of coffee drifted forward with a promise and a threat. She looked at the attendant. Then at the woman. Then at the empty space where her carry-on should fit besides 1A. It was a very small thing to take a step back and make yourself smaller to keep everyone else moving. She'd done it 1,000 times. She could do it again and go home and sleep and wake up and build more unassailable things. She could pay the tax and call it pragmatism. The boarding music looped, a breath too loud. The curtain stirred again, as if someone had whispered behind it. Her hand closed around the top of her bag. She felt the leather under her palm, soft, resilient, designed to last. She felt the steadiness of her breath, the count of it, the way you count before you buy a company or before you decide to let it die. She felt, as clearly as if it were printed on a screen, the line where apology should have ended and entitlement began. "No," she said quietly, not to the attendant, not even to the woman, but to the expectation that had been offered to her like a seatbelt. "This is my seat." The attendant's eyes flicked from her to the tablet and back again, a decision gathering like weather. The woman in 1A smiled, a lazy, inevitable smile, as if physics and etiquette were both on her side. Somewhere, a phone camera rose and hovered, pretending to be checking email. The cabin waited, leaning without moving. The interphone at the galley chimed. The second attendant lifted it, listened, straightened, then looked directly at her. Something changed in the temperature of the air. "Ma'am," the attendant said, voice suddenly careful. "The captain would like a word with you." The woman in 1A laughed again, but this time it sounded brittle. "Oh, please. We're really doing this?" She did not move her gaze. Calm. Steady. The kind of quiet that unspools a room. She nodded once to the attendant and stepped half a pace forward, refusing to retreat, refusing to relinquish the narrow piece of heaven she had already paid for in full a long time ago. The cabin held its breath as the attendant gestured toward the phone, as if the soft plastic receiver might tip the balance of the night. And then, before the words came through the line, before the curtain swayed again, before the plane backed away from the gate, the entire first-class cabin felt the ground shift, without yet knowing why. The attendant still held the interphone like it was a lifeline, her knuckles whitening as the captain's words hummed faintly through the receiver. The sound wasn't audible to anyone else, but whatever was said made her posture stiffen, made her eyes flicker to the woman in 1A, then back to the passenger still standing in the aisle with her boarding pass steady in her hand. Something in her gaze shifted, like a curtain lifting in a theater when the audience isn't ready. She nodded once, whispered a tight, "Yes, understood," then hung up. The silence in the cabin thickened. Conversations in the back had dimmed to murmurs, curiosity stretching forward like a tide. First class was not supposed to have scenes. It was supposed to glide with the same smoothness as the champagne poured into crystal flutes. But now there was a fracture, a sharp edge, and no one knew how to cover it. "I apologize, Ms. Johnson," the attendant said carefully, handing back her boarding pass. "The captain is aware of the situation. We're working to resolve the seat assignment issue right now." The blonde woman in the seat leaned back with an exaggerated sigh, as if the whole ordeal bored her. She plucked an olive from the tiny ramekin on the side table, popped it into her mouth, and smiled around it. "Working to resolve? There's nothing to resolve. I'm seated. She isn't. End of story." The words landed with a casual cruelty. Her sunglasses still shielded her eyes, but the tilt of her head dripped with condescension. She tapped her boarding pass against her manicured nails like a gavel. "These mistakes happen all the time. But let's be realistic. Who do you think is the intended passenger for this seat?" She let her hand float toward herself, then drifted it lazily toward the standing woman. "And who do you think was misallocated? You don't have to say it out loud. We all know." The businessman across the aisle coughed, loudly, as though trying to clear the air itself. The couple in row 2 exchanged a look, one of those quick marital glances that carried a whole silent conversation. "This is ugly, this is wrong, but we're strangers, and strangers don't intervene in first-class disputes." A woman further down leaned slightly into the aisle, her phone angled just so, recording without appearing to. Amara, though no one yet knew her name, didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her expression composed. She had weathered boardroom insults disguised as questions, shareholders who smiled while doubting her, competitors who thought underestimation was a strategy. She recognized the tone. The words had different costumes here, but the meaning was ancient. Still, the attendant squirmed. Perhaps we can offer one of you a complimentary upgrade voucher for a future flight, and… Why should I move? The blonde woman cut in, laughter sharp and bright. I'm comfortable. I'm settled. I belong here. She doesn't. The word hung there, belong. It turned the luxury cabin into a courtroom. Every polished surface, every chrome accent, reflected the tension like a mirror. The blonde woman's confidence radiated not just from entitlement but from the certainty that the cabin, these witnesses, would agree by default. That the optics favored her. That her skin, her clothing, her assumptions, were a shield too strong to pierce. The attendant looked helpless, her hands twisting around the tablet. Ma'am, both tickets are valid. We'll need to sort this properly. The blonde woman's smile hardened. Then sort it. But let me save you the trouble. She'll be happier back in economy. Or maybe premium if you're generous. Those rows are made for people like her. A collective breath sucked in from nearby passengers. No one moved. No one spoke. Yet the weight of those words pressed on them all. It was too overt now, the mask slipping. The venom coated in sugar had dripped bare. Amara's heartbeat remained steady, each thrum a reminder of the years she had built herself out of grit and sleepless nights, of the way she had carved a seat at every table that told her she wasn't welcome. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides, but her eyes, dark, sharp, unyielding, lifted and met those of the blonde woman directly. This seat, she said evenly, is mine. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried a clarity that sliced through the murmurs, through the awkward coughs and embarrassed glances. It demanded no validation. It was fact. The blonde woman laughed, high-pitched, brittle. Do you hear her? Acting like she owns the place. She shook her head and turned to the businessman across the aisle as if recruiting allies. Can you imagine the nerve? First class isn't just about money, it's about fit. Standards. I've flown this airline dozens of times. They know me here. And now she's claiming what isn't hers. The businessman didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his hand clenched around the armrest, but he kept his eyes down. The attendant's radio crackled again. Another voice, lower, firmer, instructions spilling in. The attendant straightened, nodded once, and stepped closer to the standing woman. Ma'am, the captain says, please hold your position. He'll address the situation directly. The words shifted the cabin again. A ripple went through the passengers. What captain steps in for a seating dispute? What passenger requires that level of attention? The mystery deepened, weaving itself around every witness. The blonde woman's smile faltered, just a fraction. She turned toward the attendant, incredulous. The captain? For this? Don't tell me you're wasting his time with nonsense. The attendant did not answer. Her eyes darted between the women, then settled on Amara, soft with something like respect, though she didn't yet understand why. Amara exhaled, slow and measured, a breath that steadied her in storm after storm. She had endured bigger stages than this, harsher lights than the overhead glow of a luxury cabin. She could wait. But around her, the tension kept building. Passengers shifted, the hum of whispers growing as people shared theories, judgments, pieces of speculation. Words floated like pollen: mistake, unfair, overbooked, discrimination. The atmosphere thickened until the air itself felt heavy. The blonde woman tossed her hair, forced a smile back onto her lips, and said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. I'll tell you exactly what's happening. The airline made an error, but instead of correcting it logically, they're indulging some dramatic fantasy. She probably sweet-talked her way into an upgrade at the gate, and now she's clinging to it like a child refusing to share a toy. It's pathetic. Gasps. Murmurs. The couple in row 2 looked away, shame flickering across their faces as if they themselves had spoken the words. Amara let the silence stretch, refusing to fill it. She had learned long ago that silence, wielded correctly, could be sharper than a blade. The blonde woman fidgeted under that silence, her smile twitching, her champagne glass trembling just slightly against the rim of its holder. Then the intercom dinged. The captain's voice filled the cabin, warm but commanding, the kind that brokered no argument. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Before departure, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a distinguished passenger joining us tonight. We are honored to have our CEO flying with us this evening. Please give your attention and respect to Ms. Amara Johnson." The cabin erupted. Gasps, exclamations, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Heads turned, eyes widened, passengers craned for a better view. Every phone lifted higher now, no one pretending anymore. The blonde woman's glass slipped from her fingers and wobbled in its holder, champagne sloshing over the rim. Her sunglasses tilted down, exposing wide, horrified eyes. Her face drained of color so fast it was almost comical. Amara did not move. She stood in the aisle, calm as ever, the truth revealed not by her words but by the authority of the sky itself. The blonde woman's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She stammered, her voice cracking. "Why, you're the CEO? But that's impossible." And the cabin, charged with electricity, leaned closer, waiting to see what the woman who owned the airline would do next. The champagne glass wobbled once more before settling into its holder, its rim sticky with spilled liquid. The blonde woman fumbled for a napkin, her movements jerky, her once perfect composure fraying in front of dozens of watching eyes. The cabin had shifted entirely. A second ago, she was certain the tide was on her side, that appearances and assumptions would drown the stranger who dared claim 1A. But the captain's voice had detonated the illusion. The passengers weren't looking at her anymore. Every set of eyes had swung, magnetized, toward the woman still standing in the aisle with calm dignity. Amara's silence had weight. The kind of silence that didn't come from lack of words but from complete control. She didn't need to correct anyone. The correction had already arrived, stamped with the authority of the captain, echoed through the intercom like a verdict. She simply stood, hands steady, gaze level, letting the truth settle in the bones of every witness. The blonde woman, Karen, as her monogram tote whispered, finally managed to produce a sound. You're Amara Johnson?" The name fell from her lips with disbelief, like she was saying a ghost's name out loud. "The CEO? Of this airline?" A murmur swept through the cabin, rolling like a wave hitting sand. "Yes. That's what the captain said." People craned their necks, phones tilted, whispers collided into sentences. Asterisk, she owns the airline. She owns it. Asterisk, the businessman across the aisle, who had sat tight-lipped during the confrontation, now looked at Amara with something like awe, the corners of his mouth twitching as though he wanted to applaud right then and there. Karen's voice cracked again, desperation seeping in. This must be some kind of joke. You're dressed like a passenger, not an executive." She gestured vaguely toward the navy suit, as though expecting gold embroidery or jewels to announce authority. "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know?" Amara finally spoke, her voice low but carrying across the space with crystalline clarity. "You didn't need to know. Respect isn't dependent on recognition." It landed like a hammer. Some passengers nodded subtly, others looked down, embarrassed by their earlier silence. Karen flushed red, stammering as her words tangled into each other. "I didn't mean anything by it. It was just confusion. A misunderstanding. I wasn't trying to." The sentence withered under the weight of the obvious. She had been trying. Everyone knew it now. The sly smile, the dismissive tone, the phrase "people like you." No one needed the replay. It was etched into every witness's memory. The attendant, who had been frozen with tension, exhaled softly, shoulders sagging in relief. She adjusted her scarf and looked at Amara differently now, not just as a passenger, but as the woman whose decisions defined her uniform, her training, her job. Respect tinged her every movement. "Ms. Johnson, please let us correct this at once." Karen scrambled, her voice pitching higher. No, I'll move, of course I'll move. I was tired, I didn't realize, please, I insist, take the seat." Her hands fluttered like broken wings as she reached for her tote, as if performing contrition could erase the arrogance from minutes before. But Amara didn't sit. Not yet. She remained standing, the focus of the entire cabin. She let the weight of the moment build, allowed the silence to stretch until every passenger felt the truth pressing down on them. It wasn't just about a seat. It never had been. It was about the invisible lines people drew, the unspoken hierarchies people enforced with smirks and cutting words. Karen's voice trembled now, her confidence unraveling like thread. I'm sorry. I really am. You must understand I didn't know who you were. Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. And if I weren't who I am? If I were simply another passenger with the right to sit in 1A? The question pierced deeper than any accusation. The cabin went utterly still. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. She looked like someone gasping underwater, struggling for air. That's the point, Amara said, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. Respect should not be reserved for the powerful. It should not be conditional. The applause started softly, a few hands clapping hesitantly from the middle rows, then growing louder as more joined in. The sound filled the cabin, not thunderous but steady, like rain on a roof, unavoidable, undeniable. Karen's shoulders hunched as though each clap struck her spine. She sank into herself, shrinking smaller and smaller in the wide leather seat that had once made her feel larger. Karen tried again, whispering this time, frantic. Please! I didn't mean to offend. Let's just move on. Amara's gaze was steady, unwavering. For a long moment she let Karen squirm under the scrutiny not just of her eyes but of the entire cabin's. Then she turned slightly, glancing toward the attendant. Would you kindly escort this passenger to a seat more fitting? The attendant blinked, startled but quick to recover. Yes, of course, Ms. Johnson. Her voice carried the faintest trace of satisfaction now. She gestured for Karen to gather her belongings. Karen's face twisted, a mix of disbelief and humiliation. Wait, you're sending me back? To economy? The word hit her lips like poison. She clutched her scarf tighter, her voice breaking. You can't do that. I paid for this ticket. Amara's expression did not falter. And yet you forgot the first thing you should have carried on board, decency. On this airline, no one sits above respect, and no one beneath it. Gasps met her words. A few passengers outright smiled, murmuring to each other. The applause reignited, firmer this time, unrestrained. Karen rose at last, her movements jerky, her cheeks blotched crimson. She grabbed her tote and stumbled into the aisle, trying to maintain some shred of dignity as she walked past the rows. But the stares were sharp, the whispers louder now. Each step toward the curtain felt like a mile. And when she finally disappeared into economy, her presence seemed to vanish with her, like a storm cloud driven off by wind. The attendant quickly fluffed the pillow at 1A, smoothing the seat as though to erase Karen's presence entirely. She looked at Amara and gestured. Your seat is ready, Ms. Johnson. But still, Amara didn't sit. Not yet. She turned, facing the cabin, her hands resting lightly on her bag. Her voice was soft but carried clearly. Let this be a reminder. Every person who boards this plane is entitled to dignity. Whether they sit in the first row or the last, they are owed the same respect. That is the promise of this airline. The applause swelled again, genuine and strong. Some passengers even rose slightly in their seats, nodding in agreement, their earlier silence repaid with recognition. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, his eyes bright. That, he said, almost reverently, was the most satisfying lesson I've ever seen delivered on an airplane. At last, Amara gave a small nod of acknowledgement. She set her bag neatly into the overhead, lowered herself into seat 1A with quiet grace, and accepted the fresh glass of champagne handed to her with trembling respect by the attendant. She lifted it slightly in a wordless toast, not to power, not to victory, but to principle. The engines roared to life beneath the floor, the vibration humming through the cabin. Passengers settled back, but the air buzzed with the electricity of what they had just witnessed. Phones buzzed as messages were sent. You won't believe what just happened in first class. And though Amara closed her eyes for a moment, calm at last, she knew the story of this flight had already left the cabin. It was carried in whispers, in recordings, in every retelling that would spread far beyond the clouds. The woman who had been dismissed, underestimated, insulted, had shown the cabin, and the world, that respect is not given by seats or titles. It is claimed by truth. And yet, everyone knew the final act was still to come. The real justice had only just begun to unfold. The engine surged beneath them, the vibrations thrumming through the cabin like the heartbeat of a giant. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, but inside the first-class section the passengers were still replaying what had just unfolded. Some leaned toward their neighbors, whispering with wide eyes. Others scrolled quickly through their phones, typing furiously, knowing the story would spread before they even touched the sky. A few simply sat in quiet awe, stealing glances at the woman now seated in 1A, their expressions carrying the kind of respect that could not be faked. Amara settled into the leather seat as if it had been waiting for her all along, her posture calm, her gaze steady on the aisle. She had faced down hostile boardrooms and rivals with sharper knives, but this moment had been different. This wasn't about contracts or numbers. This was about the raw essence of dignity, the quiet insistence that no one should ever be treated as less. She accepted the champagne glass handed to her with both gratitude and gravity, holding it lightly between her fingers. Behind the curtain, the shuffle of movement echoed faintly. Karen had been escorted to economy. Her heels had clacked indignantly on the floor as she passed row after row of eyes that refused to meet hers. Passengers there had already heard pieces of the story, and as she sat wedged between strangers in the narrow seat she had mocked only minutes before, humiliation clung to her like a second skin. She tugged at her scarf, tried to avoid the stares, but the air was heavy with her disgrace. The humiliation she had intended for someone else now wrapped itself around her, suffocating. In first class, the mood shifted from tension to celebration. The businessman across the aisle leaned closer, his voice pitched low but brimming with admiration. "I've traveled thousands of flights, seen dozens of disputes, but never anything like that. You didn't raise your voice once, yet the entire cabin heard the truth louder than thunder." Amara allowed a small smile, the faintest curve of her lips. "Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. People hear themselves more clearly in it." A woman in the second row leaned forward. "Ms. Johnson, if I may say, thank you. Not just for how you handled her, but for reminding all of us that respect isn't a class upgrade. It's a right." Her words wavered, her eyes shining faintly. That meant something. Amara inclined her head, her gaze gentle. "Respect should travel farther than any plane. If it doesn't, then all of this." She gestured softly around the cabin, the polished leather, the champagne, the curated luxury. "Is just theater." The attendants moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, their steps lighter, their smiles steadier. They offered refills, adjusted blankets, tucked bags more carefully into compartments. Each one glanced toward Amara with reverence. This wasn't just their CEO. It was someone who had just proven that the values the airline claimed in glossy brochures actually lived in the air between its rows. The seatbelt sign chimed. The nose lifted. Engines roared louder as the aircraft lunged forward, leaving the ground in a smooth climb. The city below shrank into grids of light, then into specks, then into nothing but darkness pierced by a scattering of stars. First class tilted back into its cradle, recliners humming into comfort. But nobody slept. Not yet. Karen's voice drifted faintly from economy, sharp and brittle, complaining to an attendant. "I paid for first class. I deserve it. Do you know who I am?" Her protests faltered when the attendant simply replied, "Yes, ma'am, we all do." Laughter rippled quietly through the rows around her, contained but undeniable. She sank lower, heat crawling up her neck. Meanwhile, in 1A, Amara rested her head against the cushion and closed her eyes. She knew stories traveled faster than any jet stream. Already the recordings would be posted, the captions written, the comments swelling. She didn't need to imagine the headlines. They would write themselves. Entitled passenger tries to take seat, learns it belongs to airline CEO. The truth would travel farther than this flight's destination, and she hadn't needed to do anything but remain herself. The businessman across the aisle raised his glass, his voice carrying softly through the cabin. "To dignity," he said. Others followed, glasses lifted, clinks echoing gently like a chorus. Amara lifted hers too, meeting their eyes. "To dignity," she repeated, her tone rich with both finality and promise. Hours later, when the cabin lights dimmed to mimic the night sky, some passengers finally dozed. But many stayed awake, scrolling endlessly through social media. Clips of the incident were already circulating: Karen's smirk, her dismissive words, the captain's announcement, the eruption of applause. People commented with fury, with admiration, with disbelief. By the time the plane would land, the story would be global. Karen's name might never be spoken, but her face would be remembered, frozen in the instant her arrogance shattered. As for Amara, she didn't need to read the comments. Her victory wasn't in viral fame. It was in the eyes of the passengers who now looked at one another differently. It was in the quiet apologies whispered later by the couple in row 2, who admitted they had stayed silent when they should have spoken. It was in the small nods of gratitude from strangers who knew what it felt like to be dismissed. When the plane finally touched down, the landing smooth and sure, the applause returned as though rehearsed. Passengers clapped not for the landing, but for the woman in 1A who had reminded them what respect looked like when it stood firm. The sound followed her down the jet bridge, a wave of acknowledgement that couldn't be contained in the cabin. Karen slipped off the plane behind everyone else, sunglasses shoved back on to hide the tears of shame. No one gave her the sympathy she wanted. Some ignored her entirely. Others glanced at her with thinly veiled contempt. Her fall from self-appointed grace was complete. Amara walked with quiet steps, unbothered by the weight of eyes on her. She didn't need applause, didn't need revenge. She had carried herself with the same dignity from start to finish, and that was enough. Outside, the cool night air swept around her. She inhaled deeply, letting it wash away the last remnants of tension. Another flight completed, another lesson left in her wake. She smiled faintly, speaking only to herself, though the words carried into the night like a promise. "Respect is the only class that matters." And with that, she disappeared into the dark, leaving behind a story that passengers, and soon the world, would never forget. She had boarded as a target of prejudice. She left as a symbol of truth.